So after finishing the Civil War and Reconstruction unit, we talked about U.S. industrialism and how the U.S. economy could refocus from a war economy during the Civil War to a peace economy providing consumer goods. Not only did businesses want to sell their consumer goods within the United States, but after the closing of the Western frontier, they really want to expand their business interests throughout the world. The United States government sponsors a lot of that through American imperialism, and so that's what this lesson is going to talk about. First off, you have to stop and think, is expansion a good idea? There's two sides to that. Those in favor of expansion said that the U.S. was primed for new markets after the closing of the Western frontier. They were eager to make more money around the world. However, those opposed to expansion said that expanding U.S. influence in the world went against Washington's farewell address and the policy of neutrality, something that the United States had tried to maintain for over 100 years. Entangling ourselves in foreign affairs would only lead to bad things. How did we achieve expansion? Naval power is key. In this time period, there's no planes, and you can't take a train across an ocean. So, naval power is key to the United States expanding its influence throughout the world. The opening of Japan. Commodore Matthew Perry meets with Japanese officials in 1853. He supposedly impresses them with U.S. industrial improvements and their naval power, and Japan agrees to a treaty guaranteeing friendly trade relations. The reality really is that Matthew Perry parked a bunch of naval destroyers off the coast of Tokyo, and while sitting and negotiating, is more or less intimidating the Japanese government. So they signed their treaty, but a lot of historians think they signed it under duress. The Sino-Japanese War between China and Japan ends with Japan as the hands-down winner. And following that war, there are various spheres of influence throughout China. China is a little too weak to resist after the fighting of this Sino-Japanese War. So Japan, who had won the war, but also Russia, Britain, France, and Germany all had spheres of influence in China. I'll show you that on a map in a moment. In 1899 and 1900, the U.S. initiated an open door policy. This allowed any nation to expect equal trading rights in China. Essentially, the United States wanted in on the action. Here is a map in 1910 of spheres of influence in China. Now, the United States never controlled swaths of land like all of these countries did, but we did absolutely muscle our way in via the open door policy to having trading rights in China. Sugar growers from the United States, utilizing the Hawaiian tropical climates to grow their sugar, overthrow the Hawaiian government in 1893 in an attempt to turn the territory over to the U.S. government, which would in turn increase their profits because they aren't paying any duties or taxes to the Hawaiian government anymore. For a period of 5 years, Hawaii was independent. However, in 1898, it becomes a U.S. territory. It's better known in history for, in 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, the major naval base housing the Pacific Fleet of the United States Navy, is attacked by the Japanese, which brings the United States into World War II. And in 1959, Hawaii becomes a state. But the important part of our study of American imperialism is that Hawaii was its own entity, allowing U.S. sugar growers to utilize Hawaiian property, and those U.S. sugar growers overthrew the government to make more profit. This is all part of American influence expanding in the world. Samoa can be seen here, and in the 1880s, the United States and Germany are competing for influence in Samoa to the point where we almost go to war, but we agree to split the territory with Germany. The single most significant part of this lesson is the Spanish-American War. And there are these three terms on this slide that are important, and there's more to come. But I can't stress enough how important it is to know the play-by-play of the Spanish-American War. Yellow journalism, and it's important to key in on this term, yellow. In the Old West, to call somebody a coward, you would call them yellow. And so that's where the term yellow journalism comes from, because people in the media that were saying things that were bordering on lies, they're not really true. They're sensationalizing all these stories to achieve a certain goal, and in this case, that goal is war with Spain. The DeLome letter was absolutely one of those things that yellow journalists were using to encourage war with Spain. They printed in newspapers a copy of a letter by the Spanish minister to the United States criticizing President William McKinley. A lot of people are demanding for war with Spain. McKinley hesitates. His logic really is, if I went to war every time somebody insulted me, we'd be at war all over the world. So he doesn't allow the DeLome letter to drag the United States into war, but it is certainly causing the average American citizen to question whether we should or not go to war with Spain. And finally, the last straw that drags us into the war with Spain is the sinking of the USS Maine. It explodes in Havana Harbor in Cuba a few days after the DeLome letter was printed, and it's immediately blamed on Spain. So this is just the straw that broke the camel's back. And eventually, war is inevitable. McKinley cannot avoid going to war after the sinking of the Maine. Interesting part is that the USS Maine, and here's a picture of the wreckage, there's no proof to this day, after many, many studies, what exactly happened. It very well could have been the Spanish sinking the Maine. There are also theories that the coal boiler that ran the ship overheated and exploded. And there is one theory that even says that the United States itself blew up its own ship to justify war with Spain. None of those three theories are proven, but the one that is utilized to go to war with Spain is the idea that this had to be the work of Spain. What are some other motives of going to war other than nationalism? Naval planners are viewing Cuba as a great location for a new naval base. Also, the whole idea of any other nation controlling any kind of army or navy bases only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, that's unacceptable to the United States and to the United States national security in the views of these naval planners. Also, U.S. sugar companies had invested $50 million. That's a lot of money even today, and based on the rates of inflation, is worth even more money back then. They'd invested all this money in Cuban sugar plantations, and the Spanish government was not being cooperative. A friendlier, independent Cuba would probably be better for U.S. profits. Does it sound familiar? To Hawaii, sugar is involved, and the profits from the growing of sugar. So one of the motivations for gaining Cuban independence was so that U.S. companies could enjoy more profits in the sugar industry. This little saying that the Spanish-American War was a splendid little war. Why would we say that? Well, because in 1898, at the end of the war, Spain gives up Puerto Rico and Guam. I'll show you on maps where those are located in a moment. And grants Cuba its independence, which we just mentioned as being very important to U.S. sugar trust interests. They also sell, I put this in quotes, the Philippine Islands to the U.S. for the bargain basement price of $20 million. Allow me to take us back to an earlier lesson earlier in the year. James K. Polk starts the Mexican War. He does so in a manipulative way, sending U.S. troops into a disputed territory in what is today Texas, near the Rio Grande River. He does so knowing that Mexico will fire on U.S. troops. Once the war is over, we gain the Mexican cession, which is most of the southwest United States today. And they pay only $15 million for it. But there is a chapter in Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States that is titled, "We Take Nothing by Conquest, Thank God." And it's really a way for U.S. government officials to justify the unjust war against Mexico by saying, well, we paid them for the land in the end, so it's not immoral. Well, the same can be said here. At the end of the Spanish-American War, the Philippine Islands are sold to the U.S. for the bargain basement price of $20 million. The motivation here is the same. U.S. expansion for cheap prices. The Platt Amendment in 1901 followed 3 years later, and Cuba had to lease a naval base to the United States as part of this treaty. They could not allow any other nation to acquire Cuban territory but the United States, and Cuba had to allow the U.S. to intervene in their affairs whenever U.S. citizens were threatened. That's a pretty generous agreement with the United States, and that is really due to the sugar industry in Cuba, as well as the interest in having a naval base in Cuba. So quite a bit of the motivation for the Spanish-American War was to gain territory, to gain naval bases, so that we could have an influence throughout the world that would allow U.S. companies to make more money. Here's a map. Puerto Rico, which is located here outside of the Gulf of Mexico to the east of Cuba, And here is a zoomed in map of Puerto Rico. Capital city of San Juan right here on the northern coast. And then here are the Philippines, which we bought for $20 million. Guam, which was given to the United States. We already controlled American Samoa out here. Hawaii off the map out here. So we're gaining influence throughout the Caribbean and throughout the Pacific. The Roosevelt Corollary. The word corollary really means in addition to, and this was in addition to the Monroe Doctrine. Roosevelt believed that Spain and any other nation threatened U.S. security by controlling parts of Latin America. So in his opinion, that violated the Monroe Doctrine. He used this reasoning to justify intervening in Latin American affairs, and that gets the title the Roosevelt Corollary. The best example of this is when the U.S. sponsors an uprising in Panama for the sole purpose of constructing the Panama Canal. Why? So that the U.S. could move between oceans as a navy, but also move between oceans to make trading and money-making and profits more efficient. This is a famous political cartoon showing Teddy Roosevelt pulling a string of what looks like toys, ships throughout the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. And the saying, to walk softly and carry a big stick. This political cartoon and that saying are attributed to Teddy Roosevelt. After Roosevelt comes William Howard Taft. And aside from being well known as the president who got stuck in the White House bathtub because of what a large man he was, he continues Roosevelt's interventionist policies in Latin America. And he called his continuation of these policies dollar diplomacy because he is protecting U.S. business interests in Latin America whenever he intervenes. So the U.S. invests a lot of money in these places, so money is involved, hence dollar diplomacy. And he's protecting U.S. monetary interests by intervening in these places. So again, money, dollar diplomacy. This is a photo of William Howard Taft. You can see what a large man he was and how he would have been easily stuck in the White House bathtub. This is the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you take the online quiz. Use your notes. If you use your notes, there's really no reason you shouldn't get 100. Thank you. See you in class.